few days ago I watched a video of somebody doing a 2,000 mile trip in a Tesla. If you're not familiar with Teslas, they are electric cars, and he was detailing his experience in making the 2,000 mile trip. He had to recharge, I think it was 11 times, and spent a total of around 11 hours charging the vehicle. And over the last probably 8 to 9 years I've been watching with some interest the development of electric vehicles. Several months ago I posted a video on electric vehicles and the way that they negatively impact the environment. But I took that video down because it didn't offer any alternatives, so it was kind of a pointless video. In my working life over the last 40 years I've driven almost 2 million miles, and one of the things that concerns me is the direction that transportation is heading, no pun intended. The way we're heading and the ideas and plans that the government have in place are dead ends. It's, I think, a case of, at the moment, they're more interested in tax revenue than they are in a real sensible alternative to the mainstream transport that we have now, which is petrol and diesel vehicles. I would say at this point, this is not my usual type of video. I'm not someone that's heavily into the future of the environment. It does concern me, but I don't believe that the current hysteria of electric vehicles is going to help. So if you're not interested in that sort of thing, then just skip the video. I'll be back to the more normal things in the next one. But in this video I wanted to offer my idea for a possible alternative to electric vehicles. This is not a weird and wonderful contraption that I'm going to build. It's more to do with sources of fuel. So firstly, why do we need an alternative to electric vehicles? And in my opinion, they're impractical. If you're going down to the shops once or twice a week, they might work. If you're willing to use them to make a field trip, to post a YouTube video, then it might be interesting. But if, like me, you needed to travel relatively long distances in reasonable times, then they're just unusable. They're totally impractical. They're expensive to manufacture and maintain. At some point, the savings that people claim they make on the fuel itself, the electricity, will change. The government will at some point impose fuel tax on electric that's used for vehicles. They will have to do that. There's no way they can give up the billions of pounds of revenue they currently make on liquid fuels. So it will be put on to electricity used in electric vehicles at some point. Also, electric vehicles generate more pollution than modern diesels, and I won't go into that in a huge amount of detail in this video, but if you are interested in why I say that, I will briefly give some indication here. But if you want more information, I will post a video showing you some figures, but it's very easy to work out. Basically anyone can work it out. It's not difficult. The first things are, with electric vehicles, is you're looking at an efficiency that's based on the amount of power that's generated at the power station or wherever it's created, and how much of that ends up at the wheels of the car. So firstly, you have losses in the power generation itself. That's almost equivalent to the losses that you get in the internal combustion engine when the fuel is burnt in a diesel or petrol. You then have losses in distribution, so it's not a loss-free system. There's quite a lot of losses when you transmit electricity over any distance in the power lines. You then have to convert that electricity coming into your system, that's your charger or whatever you're using, and it has to be converted into a form that can be put into the batteries, and that's again not loss-free. You lose some energy doing that. You actually lose energy when you put power into a battery. It varies depending on the type of battery, but again, all these steps are not loss-free. You lose power at each step, or energy I should say. You then have the same issue when you try to extract the power from the battery. You then have losses in the control systems. In other words, it's losses in the systems that feed power from the battery to the motors in the car. You then of course have the power conversion loss, that's the losses in the electric motors. You then have the mechanical loss, that's the losses from the output of the motor to the wheels. It's equivalent to the losses between the engine and the wheels on an internal combustion car, although they should be much less in an electric vehicle because the transmission is simpler. But you then have hidden losses which aren't usually considered, such as using the vehicle in cold or bad weather. So if you need the heater on to demist the window, Teslas for example tend to run the battery heaters overnight in cold weather. All that adds up and you can easily use a day's worth of energy just overnight, keeping the batteries in good order in very cold weather. And of course that doesn't happen with a petrol or diesel car. The heating for bad weather or cold weather is actually the waste energy that electric vehicle owners don't have access to because that's lost at the power station. So when you add all these together, the efficiency of an electric vehicle system is actually less than a modern diesel. Take that into account with the impracticality of electric vehicles, and I don't really see how these can be a practical alternative for everyone in the future. It might work when you've only got a few percent of people driving around in electric vehicles and they're a bit of a novelty, but there are various other things that again don't seem to be considered that I want to touch on briefly in this video. So firstly, battery and electric vehicles are technology and physics limited. I don't want to get bogged down into it, but the technology that's used in batteries will never get to the point where it's as energy dense as a liquid fuel. Now it's just down to the way that batteries work. Also, the idea and the response you normally get when you talk about electric vehicles is that, well, they're in their infancy, they haven't been around more than a few years. That's incorrect. Electric vehicles were the first commercial vehicles ever made, and that was back in the 1800s. And even in the last 15 years, battery technology has not improved that much. It's better packaged than it was, so you tend to get more range from an electric vehicle than you did a few years ago, but that's more down to the packaging of the batteries rather than their technology. And so nothing much has changed with regard to battery technology over the last 15 years. Now it may change, you might get batteries that are more efficient, but they can never approach the energy density of liquid fuel. I saw a comparison in a video a short time ago between a Tesla and a 3 Series BMW, and the claim that being made in the video was, well, they had similar performance and they both weighed the same. That was true. The difference is that the BMW had 5 times the range on a single tank of fuel than the Tesla did on a single charge. And to bring them up to parity, the Tesla's all-up weight would have to be increased by around 2,500 kilograms. That would then make it more than twice the weight of the diesel car. Also, if you were to increase the capacity of the Tesla by a factor of 5 to bring it in line with the diesel car, it would take 5 times as long to charge as it currently does. You then have issues with infrastructure required for electric vehicles, and this is essentially how do you get the power from the point of generation to the users. And we simply do not have the infrastructure to be able to do that. Even if we could generate the amount of electricity that is needed, which currently we can't, and we're quite a long way from being able to do that, upgrading the national grid to the point where it could distribute energy needed, especially at peak times for everyone, is, to all intents and purposes, impossible. We just don't have the resources to do that. The power companies are still struggling to update the power systems and distribution lines that were put in place in the early 1900s, and that's just to meet the current demands. When you increase the demand by a factor of 10, I see no way that can be made to work. We then have another issue which I've never seen it discussed anywhere, and it's one of the main concerns I would have with electric vehicles, and it's a bit like mobile phone technology, when it works fine until everyone starts using it, and then everyone's probably noticed that on New Year's Eve your phone stops working because the amount of phone traffic has exceeded the capacity of the system. Now, when you look at this in some detail, you'll know that there are around 8,000 fuel stations. This is liquid fuel stations in the UK. On average, each has 8 fuel pumps, and it takes an average vehicle around 9 minutes to refuel. That's including paying for the fuel, applying makeup, etc. So that's the average for each car that's using it. On the other hand, an electric vehicle takes around an hour, and that's in supercharging mode. If you're not familiar with that, supercharging is very high charge rate. And one of the issues you get is that most charging stations cannot support more than a few vehicles supercharging at any one time. So this hour is optimistic because it assumes that there's only one vehicle charging at any one time. And to have every single vehicle charging at that high rate would need extremely large conductors going to those stations. Even more so when you consider the implications of everyone driving electric vehicles. And this is that if you assume that the same number of people will be driving electric vehicles in the future as currently drive liquid fueled cars, and they want to travel the same distance, this is assuming no increase in population, no increase in the number of vehicles on the road. If you want to drive the same vehicle, then the electric vehicle drivers will have to refuel 5 times as frequently as a liquid fueled car, meaning that for an equivalent of a 9-minute refueling stop, you would need to spend 5 hours charging, because it takes around 1 hour to charge the vehicle. That's assuming that the capacity of the batteries doesn't increase and that everyone has access to this supercharging mode, which is, again, I see it as being very unlikely. Let's assume best case. Generally, when you go to a fuel station, a busy or even a relatively busy fuel station, there are queues at the pumps. This is for liquid fuel, where it only takes 9 minutes to refuel. So if everyone's driving electric vehicles and each vehicle needs to be stuck into the charger for 5 hours, then this is 5 hours throughout the period when normally you would recharge once. So it's not necessarily all one charge, it's the equivalent of a 9-minute charge. So this means that if you work it out, you're going to need 33 times as many refueling points for electric vehicles, this is for individual cars, pumps, compared to chargers, as we currently have in fuel stations. And that means that if you assume the average, and that's 8,000 stations, you're going to need 264,000 charge stations. This is not charge points, this is charge stations, the number of facilities used for charging. And then you multiply that by 8 to get the equivalent of the petrol stations. And that's just to allow the same number of people to recharge and travel the same distance as currently we do with liquid fueled stations. And again, these 264,000 stations, again not points but stations, has to be paid for by somebody. It has to be built. So we're then down to the commercial viability of this, which I do not see how it's going to work. Where's the money going to come from for these 250,000 stations? Where's the money going to come from to increase the national grid capacity by a factor of 10? Where's the money going to come from in loss of production when people inevitably can't travel and take some days to get anywhere? These are just some issues. There are many more issues when you start looking into it, and as I said at the beginning of this, my concern is not so much the environment, it's more the practicality of the use of electric vehicles. When it comes to the environment, whether you believe in cars being the cause of global warming or not is fairly irrelevant. We need to find an alternative anyway, and that's really what this video is about. I wanted to offer an alternative that has several benefits and in theory constitutes a practical alternative to the liquid fuel cars we're currently using. So I'll start by saying this is a fairly naive proposition on my part, not because I don't believe that it has technical or practical merit, but for political reasons. It would require the cooperation of governments in a number of countries to sort of get together, all aim for the same goal, and try to drive it forward in a sensible manner. And I'm sure that anyone that's been watching the hash that the UK has made of the Brexit deal, you'll understand that our elected politicians can't agree on the direction of up, let alone important world-changing decisions. However, I'll carry on, and this is my proposition. It's got a few beneficial side effects. Before I start, I'd say that I'm thick-skinned. If you want to respond with insults or berating comments, then fine, go ahead. But it would be far more constructive to come back with some practical feedback. And this does benefit everyone if we can find a good alternative to what, as I said, I think is a dead-end technology that we're all being coerced into using as it's been implied there is no alternative. So firstly, I'd say that liquid fuel is the way to go. It's been proven that it's by far the best fuel type to use for the masses, and there aren't really any practical alternatives unless the government starts pricing people off the road. In other words, the only way that electric vehicles can ever be practical is to cut down by a massive factor the number of vehicles that need to use the roads. And I see that as being the way that electric vehicle technology will result in no one being able to travel independently. Everyone will be forced onto public transport, and no one will have the freedom that we currently have to travel, see their relatives, or do whatever they want to do. So I'm sure that most of you know that it's possible right now to grow plants from which we can extract a suitable liquid fuel. It's done all the time, it's just not done in a very large scale. And that's the major problem, is where would we grow the amount that we would need? We need somewhere that has plenty of sunlight, lots of space, and is currently not being used for anything. And again, I'm sure that most of you can immediately think of some candidates for such places. There are plenty of poor countries that have huge amounts of open space, lots of sunlight, and the areas are not being used for anything. The problem is they're too dry. There's not enough water there to grow vegetation, or at least not in the amounts that we're talking about here. However, we also have a technology that's proven in the form of desalination plants, and these could be built in sufficient quantities to provide enough fresh water, and that could be pumped to the locations where it's required. This may sound expensive, but it's far cheaper than building millions of wind turbines, hundreds of thousands of recharge stations, and then all the impracticalities that would result in. So the price to pay for a few thousand desalination plants, I think, would be money well spent. And of course, the side effect and the advantage would be that these otherwise poor countries that, through no fault of their own, constantly hoover up money and resources from other countries trying to support them, wouldn't need that anymore. They would become financially self-supporting, and in fact they would become the next oil-rich states, and that again would save a lot of money from the countries that currently are trying to support them. It would make them independent. The main benefit is that we would have created a closed system. So what I mean by this is all the CO2 that is being extracted from the atmosphere going into these plants is the same CO2 that is released when the fuel is burnt. It's then of course reabsorbed into the plants, and that's a closed loop cycle. So we're not increasing the net amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and if that's what everyone's real concern is, then this is kind of a no-brainer. This is, as I say, it's a system that results in no net gain in CO2, and in fact the result would be an overall net reduction in CO2, because at any one time of course we'd have a lot of vegetation in the growth part of the cycle. So that's a very basic and fairly naive take on this concept. I'd be very interested in any comments that you have on this, or any ideas that you have that could be better. But as I said, my main concern is that I don't see electric vehicles as being a proper alternative for mass use into the future.